Thank you for this introduction, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here today. And I've been learning a lot this morning. And Nick, I've been presenting very nicely the specific effect of heat stress on the Paralympic athlete. On my side, I will talk a bit more about the countermeasure, about what can we do and how can we transfer our knowledge from able-bodied athlete to Paralympic athlete. And here we are not only talking about an event in Doha, even if you consider that it is hot this week, there is a lot of other events that are done in hot ambient conditions, and we are obviously preparing the next year Olympic and Paralympic game in Rio in 2016. But Rio might be warm and humid environment, but it's nothing exceptional. Summer Olympic, by definition, are held in the summer. And if we look at the recent history of the Olympic and Paralympic, most of them were held in quite warm ambient conditions. So, and there is also quite a lot of famous case of heat-related event at the Olympic, both at the beginning of the Olympic 1 century ago, before the IOC merged with the IPC, as well as some more recent examples, such as in London in 2012. But there is also some example of athletes that are able to cope properly with heat stress. And this is the case, for example, here on this picture, you can see Samuel Wanjiru, who established a new Olympic record for the marathon in Beijing, and it was in a warm and humid environment. So the question is, why can some athletes cope with the heat and some others cannot? And here, what is interesting to see as well is that most of the cases that I presented on the top of the slide occur in non-warm countries. 3 of these examples are in London. And I'm sorry, but London is generally not a warm environment. And as you can see, most of these athletes are not coming neither from warm country. Rather than in Beijing, everybody expected the condition to be warm and humid. So the athlete specifically prepare for that. So my point is that actually, if you want to protect the health and performance of your athlete, you need to and you can specifically prepare for that. And this is the same thing during mass participation event. For example, last year, it was some recrimination about the organizer of the Tel Aviv Marathon. And this marathon is held in April, at the end of the winter, but it was the first hot day of the season. So none of the athletes, none of the participants were ready for the heat. So the organizer canceled the marathon, but still organized a half marathon, thinking that will be less challenging. But people who register for a half marathon are generally less prepared than the one registering for a marathon. As a consequence, one of the runners died and 20 of them were hospitalized. So some dramatic consequences of not being ready for the heat. Conversely, in the same kind of event, in another mass participation event, in another half marathon, this time held in Malaysia, in hot and humid conditions, we can see that all the runners reach some very high temperature, all of them above 39 degrees, with some above 40 and some even above 41 Celsius degree of core temperature. We are talking about rectal temperature here. But all of them finish the race asymptomatic of exertional illness. And there is numerous examples like that you can be ready, you can prepare for the heat. For example, some triathlon held in Sydney, and here is an interesting example, because they organize the same race 3 months apart. In December, so at the beginning of the summer in the South Hemisphere, in Sydney, and in February, 3 months later. And you can see in this example that the 2 days, they got exactly the same temperature for the race. But in December, this temperature was not a seasonal temperature. It was the first hot day of the year. And 15 athletes collapsed, and 3 of them did a severe collapse diagnosed as a heat stroke. Rather than 3 months later, on the same race, by the same temperature, but this time it was a seasonal temperature, none of the athletes collapsed. So we know that heat acclimatization is inducing numerous physiological adaptations. One of the main ones is likely an increase in sweat rate, associated to a decrease in sweat sodium concentration, allowing you to better thermoregulate without losing more electrolytes. So because you better thermoregulate, you have a decrease in skin and core temperature. You also have an increase in plasma volume that associated with a lower temperature allow to decrease the cardiovascular strain and decrease the heart rate. That allow for a thermal comfort and ultimately for a better exercise performance. But as it has been presented just before by Nick, people with spinal cord injury have a lower sweat rate, have an impaired sweat rate as compared to able-bodied athletes. And you can see that this difference is increasing when environmental temperature increase. So then we can wonder, can Paralympic athlete with a lower or an impaired sweat capacity will really benefit of increasing the sweat rate? Will they really get this adaptation with heat acclimatization? So will heat acclimatization be useful for this population? And there is, so far, to the best of my knowledge, only one study in the literature that has been looking at heat acclimation in athletes with spinal cord lesion. It was a population of only 5 Paralympic athletes that did a short-term acclimatization protocol. By that I mean 7 days of heat acclimation. And the author observed a decrease in heart rate and a decrease in temperature following 7 days of acclimation. So the standard response that you will also observe in able-bodied athletes. But it was no adaptation in sweat rate. But still the conclusion is that despite the fact that no sweat response was observed, Paralympic athletes can still benefit of heat acclimatization. The second standard countermeasure that we consider, beside heat acclimatization, is generally cooling. There is 2 ways to do cooling. There is what we call the external cooling and the internal cooling. External cooling, the theory behind the usefulness of external cooling is coming from some laboratory study in which they did some cold water immersion, so whole body immersion in cold water, before to do some cycling exercise. And when you do some pre-cooling with cold water immersion before cycling in the heat, you can sustain the exercise for a longer period of time. However, in this kind of laboratory study, as you can see on the right part of the slide, you can see as well that athletes are starting to exercise with a very low heart rate. So they start with a lower temperature, but they also start with a lower heart rate, because straight after the cooling, you start to exercise. And this is kind of impossible to do in a practical setting. When you want to do a competition, you need to warm up. And then there is a practicability question. How do you do? Will you do first the warm-up, then go for the cooling? Will you do the cooling, then the warm-up? How can you really combine the two in the real world? So then the solution is probably to do both together and to use some ice vest to minimize the increase, not really to decrease the temperature, but at least to minimize the increase in temperature while you are warming up. And there is a very good study from Nick on that, who have been using some ice vest in athletes with tetraplegia. And you can see some very, very interesting result here. And the condition control corresponds to a condition without any cooling. Then, when you use the ice vest before the time to exhaustion, you significantly increase the exercise capacity of your athlete. But if you use it during as well, then you increase even more the exercise capacity of your athlete. So some very promising result with using ice vest in a Paralympic population. And there is a very good literature review that just came out this year in 2015 about cooling athlete with a spinal cord injury. And what you can see here as well is that there is some out of the box thinking as compared to able-bodied athlete. For example, you can see one study that did some foot cooling. So it's a very original way to do cooling, something that is never done with able-bodied athlete, but that can be done with Paralympic athlete. So this review that I encourage you to go to see summarize numerous studies with cooling, and the conclusions are quite clear that wearing an ice vest during intermittent sprint exercise both reduces thermal strain and enhances performance. Second conclusion is that pre-cooling and cooling during exercise or halftime, here we are talking about team sport obviously when we talk about a halftime, may be an effective strategy. But of course, every time you try to implement something, don't come in Doha and say, oh, it's hot this week, we will implement some cooling. No, you never do something new the day of the competition. If you are planning to do that in preparation of Rio, you need to start to do that in your training before that. But ice vests can be practical for pre-cooling, but not always for during cooling. For example, they can restrain your ability to move with the upper body, or they can also represent an aerodynamic disadvantage in any wheelchair race. So there is some other methods that have been developed for cooling during the event, such as using ice slurry or slushy beverage. So using ice rather than cold water is in theory more efficient, based on the principle of enthalpy. When you transform a solid in a liquid, you use a lot of energy, so that will cool you down much more to transform ice from 0 to 1 degree, rather than to transform cold water from 10 to 11 degrees, for example. But this technique has been criticized in able-bodied athletes, because when you ingest ice slurry or cold water, there is some receptor in your stomach that are detecting the cold water, and as a response to that, you are decreasing your sweat rate. So in able-bodied athletes, there is a kind of a trade-off between the benefits that you get from the heat sink provided by the cold fluid and the decrease in heat dissipation that you got by decreasing the sweat rate. But when we are talking about Paralympic athlete, a population in which the sweat rate is anyway decreased, is impaired, and is not the main source of heat dissipation, then I'm believing that the trade-off will be in favor of the heat sink, so that cold fluid or ice slurry might be a more interesting countermeasure for a Paralympic population than an able-bodied population. So in summary, and that will be my last slide, just to give some practical tips. Before the competition, before to go to Rio, you need to heat acclimatize. How to do that? Very simply, we generally recommend around 60 minutes of exercise a day in the same environment as competition. It is not always possible to do that in the same environment as competition, as you cannot always travel in advance to the competition venue. So if you cannot do that, just use a plan B, use a hot room. It's very easy to simulate heat. Just put some heater in a room in which you are training. It's one of the most easiest things to simulate heat. Your aim is to increase core and skin temperature and to try to stimulate some sweating. You do that for a few days, that will be better than nothing, but 1 week to obtain most of the adaptation, and because not all of the athletes are adapting at the same rate, if you go for 2 weeks, then you're pretty sure that all of the athletes from your team will be adapted. Then, once you are at the competition venue, consider some cooling methods. Consider both external cooling, for example during warm-up with ice vest, and then some internal cooling during the event using some ice slurry or some cold drink. But obviously, before to try that, during a competition, try it at training, and do not try anything new the day of the competition. Thank you.